Hello, everyone, and welcome. And so today we're continuing our Hilton Head 2022 YouTube Live series. And today is going to be a little bit of a tutorial or just some helpful tips on how to write a competitive abstract for Hilton Head 2022. So this is the overview for what we're going to be discussing today. One note is for the people watching in the future, not live. The description is going to be updated with links to the different parts of this talk. And so feel free to check the description if you are perhaps in a rush right before the deadline and need to jump quickly to one of these particular sections. But overall, if it's a matter of triage, there are essentially three parts that I would say are most important to get right, at least initially, if you're trying to figure out what to spend more or less time on. All right, so the first part is simply the motivation. So why would one want to attend Hilton Head? And so one note is that Hilton Head Workshop and a number of the microsystems conferences in our field are quite different from many scientific research conferences. And that's because these are considered competitive conferences. And so part of that is because the abstracts that are submitted, these are reviewed by the technical program committee. And so these are experts in the field, typically professors and those higher up in industry, who will actually review every single abstract that's been submitted. And these will be discussed in terms of figuring out who will actually get accepted to the conference. And one note is that typically these types of conferences, and Hilton Head in particular, are typically characterized by relatively lower acceptance rates. And so to provide an example, to be selected for an oral presentation at a conference like Hilton Head, typically in the past, this is a roughly 10% acceptance rate. And so one of the questions that students will sometimes ask, well, if that is the case, why go through all the trouble? And the answer to that would be in terms of the quality at the conference. And so there are a number of aspects of the conference that I would rank in terms of high quality. And so that's in terms of the research that gets presented, in terms of preliminary results that one gets exposed to by attending these conferences. The overall workshop program has a number of events that are helpful. And obviously the location is fantastic, but because of that, there are a number of opportunities for connecting with other attendees at this particular conference. I don't really know of any other conferences where a volleyball tournament, for example, is part of the conference program. And through these kind of activities, you can make some really good connections that can be helpful in terms of gaining mentors or maybe learning about new opportunities. So for me personally, actually, the pathway to me getting this job as a professor at the University of Maryland was because of a connection that I made through the rump session at Hilton Head 2012, many years ago. And so that ended up leading to me basically getting this position. So that's one of the major other aspects in terms of the quality of this particular conference. So in terms of abstracts, so the overall format, and I know it's been a while, right? So it's been 2 years since we were able to even have abstracts for Hilton Head 2020 that ended up getting canceled due to COVID. And I know many other conferences have switched more to writing the full papers initially, but this is going to be in terms of an abstract. So this is going to be limited to 2 pages. The first page is going to be 100% text, and this needs to be 600 words or less. If you go over that, there is a chance that it will be rejected. And the next page is going to be figures. And so it's basically divided in this way. And these are the main topics that we'll be discussing today in terms of how to write these different parts or put together the figures. One note is, as you can see here, that the references are in this particular section. I'm going to discuss this at the very end of the talk today. So the most important part initially is choosing a strong title that rapidly communicates, as I mentioned, the content and novelty of the work that you've done. And so this is an example of one of the talks that was selected for an oral presentation at the Hilton Head 2018 workshop. And this is kind of just an example of something that is accurate, but also kind of like interesting in a way. The key thing is try not to overstate or overclaim in your title. So what you don't want to happen is basically there's this exciting title, but then maybe the results don't really back up what's actually being claimed. And so just be careful of that. So it should be a bit of a balance where genuinely the results that you're presenting are exciting, on their own, and you're able to describe it well in terms of how you choose that title. So the next most important part by far. So this is in terms of just, at least for me personally, when I am on a technical program committee and I take a look at an abstract, we're reviewing, many different abstracts. So this can be on the order of tens to over 100 abstracts per reviewer. And as that happens, it's really important just to get a sense initially of the kind of work and the topic. And is this in my particular area? Is there another reviewer who's more suited? And so one of the first things I'll do is I'll flip to that second page and the top of that second page to see what figure 1 looks like. And so it's really critical to make an excellent first impression with that. And so these are kind of the general idea that you would want to target. Is basically that you want whoever is reading this work, and this applies really to any figure that you put together, but it is really, really important for that first figure. And you want the reader to be able to learn that concept with as much of a solid understanding as possible, as quickly as possible, and ideally as painlessly. And so these are going to be a couple examples that either my students have done or I've done. And so this particular one was selected for an oral presentation at Hilton 2020. Of course, that conference ended up being canceled, but it did go through the full peer review process to that point. And so this kind of gives you a sense of an example of one of the figure 1s that we had used for that. And then this is one that I had used when I was a postdoc quite a while ago. And so here I was trying to show the difference of traditional, what I'm referring to as biaxial control of these old micropost arrays compared to what we were presenting were these micro spring arrays with this triaxial control. And so these are kind of two approaches just that one can use as reference in terms of trying to get some type of baseline for what these might look like. So the next part after that is to get to paragraph 1. So the opening paragraph of the abstract is really important. These can be in various lengths, but one of the things that is critical is this is basically what I'm referring to as an abstract within an abstract. And so what I would recommend is taking a look at the Nature summary paragraph style and view the different parts of this and how it starts with this basic introduction. You then move into a little bit more detailed background. You get to that general problem that kind of motivates the work. And then you have that here we show, or here we introduce, here we present statement. And then there's at least one sentence of the main results, and then ideally bringing it back into a broader context. What you'll want to do, right, so you're limited to that 600 word limit. And so you're going to want to kind of refine this to probably about 4 to 5 sentences with an additional introductory statement. That's just this one sentence that you start with that gives a big picture of what you've done in this work. And so this is the example from the paper from my group that got accepted for an oral presentation at the last Hilton Head. And so here you can see we're starting with that summary statement where we introduce the work. Then we're going to lead into the basic introduction. So in this case, we're talking about controlled release for drug delivery. And then we're going to get into the general problem. Now we get into the here we present. This is kind of the main focus of the work, some of our main results, and then we provide a little bit of that broader perspective. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be this long. Again, it really depends on abstract to abstract, but just know that you will, throughout the text that you have, you will want to be able to kind of check off all of these boxes at some point. So now we're going to move on to the remaining figures. And so typically, this is just based on my personal style when I'm reviewing. I'll look at figure 1, I'll get kind of a sense, I'll go back to that first paragraph, and I'll get the overview of the work, and then I'll kind of come back and really start getting into the details of the different figures that are also kind of supporting the story. And I'll kind of do that in parallel with reading the text as well on the first page. And so here, one of the things that's going to be discussed is the fact that when you present this at the conference, of course, you're going to have your written manuscript. But at the conference itself, if you have an oral presentation, then you're going to be up on stage and you're going to be giving some type of PowerPoint presentation, or you're going to have a poster presentation. And so the way that you communicate your work visually is very important. And so there are a couple of things that are going to be of interest depending on the particular type of work that you're doing. So certainly the fabrication process is going to be important, especially with a microsystems conference or a workshop. And so try to give a sense of how that's going to look. Some papers will have theoretical results, some papers won't. It really depends. But FEA results or other types of modeling results are often included depending on the type of work. Experimental setup could be important if you have a special type of way in which you're performing the experiment, if this is being performed in the field, if it's part of they have some people who have devices that are hooked up to a cell phone, something that shows how that's being done in certain cases. Some never even include an image of their experimental setup. But certainly I think most are going to use some type of quantified experimental results or images of how the experimental performance is working. Again, it really depends from project to project, but try to see if any of these questions are ones that you want to answer through your figures that you're selecting for your work. So I'm going to show a couple examples of ones from my prior group, my groups, or my prior work personally. And so this top one, again, is coming back to that paper that we had accepted last time. And so this is our fabrication picture. So in A, we had basically computer-aided manufacturing simulations of the way that something is going to be manufactured. Then on the bottom, those are actual results during the fabrication process, showing just what's being built with time. And then in C, we have our SEM results of what it looks like afterwards. And so this is another example from many years ago when I was a postdoc. And so you can see A, B, C, and D are kind of showing the overall process. So on the top, we have the conceptual illustrations to kind of explain it a little bit better of what's happening. And then on the bottom, we're showing the actual results during the manufacturing process. And then we even included in E how this particular device operates based on the flow polarity. And so this is a different paper. This is for IEEE MEMS this year. But again, I'm just trying to provide more examples to kind of give anyone who is unsure of the types of figures that could be included in abstracts. These are just more examples to kind of help with that process. So this is an example of some of our experimental results. And so here we're demonstrating just how the flow properties work through these 3D printed structures. And then this is another paper that was accepted for an oral presentation at Microtest a couple years ago from one of my students. And this is just showing the kind of data that was important for that particular work. And so the type of data that you're going to need, it really depends on project to project, but certainly something like these kind of figures would be important, I think, for most of the abstracts that we see. So now we're going to move on to some of the main paragraphs. So typically, I think you're probably going to have only about 4 paragraphs. It's going to be what you're going to be able to, 4 or 5 is kind of the standard. It's just, again, 600 words is going to go by quite quickly. You're going to feel that as you start writing it. And so unfortunately, that means that we don't want to spend too much time in terms of background. And so there are a couple main questions that you're going to want to answer. And so first, why is this work important, right? Why is it being done? Then you're going to need to critically discuss prior work. And so this is one of those things that can lead to a paper getting rejected if you didn't adequately discuss the work from your own group that's already been done and compare what is different to that, to make sure there's no overlapping kind of presentation of data. And then also, if there are other groups in the field who have done very similar work, it is really important to be able to discuss their work and put that in context as well. So it's I would say it's just simply important for the technical program committee to be able to understand fully the context that makes your work important and new and novel. And so another part is, I would say, highlighting, again, we talked about like that general problem. So putting that general problem in a little bit more context or more specific problem. And then a little bit of guidance of what is needed to be able to overcome those deficits. So then we're going to get into the materials and methods. And so this is one where I've seen in the past some students and postdocs waste a little bit too much of their word count discussing certain fabrication steps that are essentially ubiquitous in microsystems fields. So what we're looking for here are the key details. And so if you're able to, so for example, if you're performing a photolithography or soft lithography process that's well established, simply just cite work where either your group has done it before, or you can say that we're using methods similar to those described in blank, and that should be enough. Try to only concentrate on the unique details. It is really important not to lose too much word count. I've seen examples where people are discussing the particular name of the spinner that they're using to spin coat their wafer with photoresist. Those are words that can be better spent elsewhere in terms of how you're preparing your abstract. So the results and discussion, that is really important. So oftentimes I would say the first paragraph and then the fourth paragraph are most important in terms of abstracts. And so understanding exactly what were the results and providing context for them is really, really, really important. And so I'm going to list a couple of big questions. You don't have to address every one of these questions, but try to just keep them in mind and see if you were able to. So obviously, you have to highlight the key results. There are tons of results that can be discussed, but unfortunately, right, this is not a full manuscript. You're limited to this one page of text with less than 600 words. Try to highlight the most important results that you have. One note is if there's anything that is surprising or was unexpected, this is something that should be called out. This could be a good thing. This could also be a not so good thing. Maybe there was some issue with something, or maybe there's a new phenomenon that you weren't expecting to see that you did see, right? That makes it even more interesting. Another part is comparing your results to what has happened beforehand. And so one of the things that is often done is maybe there is a certain performance metric for a type of device, and there's some standard for that. Maybe there's a quality factor or whatever that might be. And now you've demonstrated an order of magnitude improvement. Giving some hard numbers to those can really help to highlight the achievements that you have done in your work. So another part is to try to, so after you've kind of gone through results, try to bring it back again and describe how these results are important to the field. And similarly, what are the potential impacts to the field based on what you have done with your work? And so that can be a little bit, I would say, more abstract, or maybe not so soon, maybe more long-term impacts would be okay as well. But again, to kind of connect us back to what is the overall impact of your work. And so at the very end, you're going to have some references. There are essentially a couple of different ways to do this. I'm going to highlight two. So one is like the example that is on the Hilton Head website, where basically you can include your references on your figure page at the end with this particular type of format. One of the things that I like to do is I like to try to leave that final page to be just 100% figures. And I try to make it so that I can find a way to include my references on my first page. And then I'll use a format that's somewhat like this. The critical part about this type of format is you have to make sure that it is easy for the technical program committee members to be able to find that prior work. And so you have to include essentially as much information as needed. So in these cases, it wasn't too bad. But in other cases, you might have to include titles, you might have to include the DOI. There are different approaches for this, but it must be relatively easy for the TPC to be able to find these types of papers that have been referenced. And lastly, this is one of the things that I've seen a lot of students get a little bit nervous about. And so you can see in the abstract sample, so when you turn this in, there are a couple of things that you need to include. Of course, you have to list you want to be accepted for an oral presentation or a poster. Most typically are electing to be considered for an oral presentation. But the topic category is one that sometimes causes a little bit of stress for students to try to figure out where that should go. So you can choose this physical sensors, actuators, or systems. We have the chemical or biological version of that. And then there's the technology section as well. And so the advice that I would give is basically to relax a little bit with this. If you make a mistake and you happen to choose a particular category that actually isn't suited for your work, the TPC is able to discuss that and ask one of the other groups to review it instead. This happens relatively frequently. If there is some case where maybe it was mislabeled as someone put down P, but actually it's T, or maybe someone put C and it was actually T, or vice versa. So these are things that happen. Try your best and discuss with your PI or your PIs to figure out what would be the right potential category. But overall, try not to stress too much on this, because the TPC can always have a better sense of this and will always pass the paper off or the abstract off if it really is mislabeled in this part. And that really that's not going to affect acceptance in any way. So a couple of reminders at the very end. So one is that for the first time, we're going to have a Zoom-based virtual abstract workshop. And so if you are a grad student or a postdoc and you have a pretty decent draft, or maybe you have an outline for what it is that you want to include, this is an opportunity for you to connect directly with TPC members who are going to be reviewing your work and other experts in the field, to be able to kind of highlight what it is that you're considering at the moment and receive some feedback well before you actually do submit it. So this will be a full week before the abstract deadline. And then again, I very clearly want to highlight the abstract deadline, that January 25th, 2022, that is a Tuesday, all of the abstracts are due. And so make sure that you keep that in mind. And we still have quite a bit of time, right? And so it's early to mid-December at the moment, but this kind of timing is gonna come quickly. And so try to keep all this in mind as you're leading up to that. And so thank you for tuning in for today. I'm gonna see if there's any questions. I am not seeing anything that makes too much sense at the moment. And so with that, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you at Hilton Head 2022. Bye, everyone.